What's up guys, you're watching Li-Fi TCG. I got a video for you today on Pauper Tron. Now, not too long ago, Tron and Pauper was one of the scariest decks in the format. It basically could do anything. So the idea was that in a matchup where your opponent's playing like Burn or Aggro, you had all the life gain and a bunch of fog effects. In a matchup where your opponent was playing Control, you had Mystical Teachings into a bunch of Counterspells into the Flicker Lock to prevent your opponent from doing anything. And then whatever was in between, well, you just had twice as much mana as your opponent and a bunch of Mulldrifters, so that was going to carry you through most games. But the problem with Tron now is with the bans recently, the Prophetic Prism ban and the Bonder's Ornament ban, you lost a lot of the solid foundation for what kind of ties the deck together. You don't have as good a way to convert your colorless mana into colored mana anymore, which means that you need to spend a lot more time and effort getting your engine going. Just things don't go as smoothly for the deck anymore as they did in the past, and what you've seen now is that the deck has basically disappeared from the tournament results. So you do have the dedicated Turbo Fog deck now, which is putting up some decent results. It's trying to emulate some of what the Tron deck did in the past, but the kind of like jack of all trades, multifaceted approach from the Tron deck just isn't working anymore. So that's what I'm going to try and address with this list that I've been playing recently. So we'll start with the mana base. We have the 12 Tron lands, of course. No doubt about it. Then we have some new cards from Baldur's Gate. 4 Sea Gate and 2 Heap Gate. So still waiting on the second one. So Sea Gate is essentially like a functional reprint of a card the deck played in the past, which is Thriving Isle. Basically the text is exactly the same. It taps for blue mana, comes into play tapped, choose a color, it also adds that color, but it has the subtype Gate. So that is relevant for the Heap Gate. So Heap Gate is another spin on a card the deck played before, which was Cave of Temptation and previously Shimmering Grotto. So the main essence of that is a land that comes into play untapped, taps for colorless, and then you can pay 1 and tap it to add 1 mana of any color. So because you're like a 5 color control deck, even though the mana fixing ability like costs you a mana, the fact that it comes into play untapped and gives you 5 colors is like the best version of that kind of 5 color flexibility that Pauper has access to. So the original printing, Shimmering Grotto, didn't have any extra abilities. Then in I think Modern Horizons 1 we got Cave of Temptation, which you could pay 4 mana, tap it and sack it to put 2+1 counters on a creature, which was sometimes useful for like making your Mulldrifter a 4/4, but wasn't generally something that came up in most games. But now you have this new card, Heap Gate. So again, it has the same Shimmering Grotto 5 color mana ability, but it has the additional ability you can pay 1 mana, tap itself, and tap an untapped gate, make a treasure. So of course we have the Sea Gates now, which are all gates. Or if you have 2 Heap Gates in play, you can do it as well. And that ability is really, really strong. Much stronger than Cave of Temptation. Being able to bank treasures for later turns gives you so much flexibility, like with your flicker loop. You can get multiple if you store a bunch of treasures, you can get extra flickers in one turn, which lets you deal with your opponent's board or like play around removal on your stuff with Ephemerate, things like that. It gives you the mana ramp to like use your teachings or fight counter wars, and then if it basically lets you commit in spots. If your opponent doesn't have the answer, then you just leave your treasures there, you're fine. But if your opponent does commit, then you can punish them by countering back with that extra treasure mana. So it's just a thing that you can do. In any like end of turn situation where you don't have any play to make, you just start banking treasures, and in the late game it will like basically always come up. It will always matter. It's a very strong addition to the deck just from these upgrading the Cave of Temptation and the Thriving Isle to this Gate package is a pretty relevant upgrade. And then we'll see later the Gate typing actually matters even more. But we'll talk about that when we get to it. And the last few lands, I'm playing one Bojuka Bog main deck, just as like a crop rotation / expedition map target. It lets you have another angle of attack versus decks like Cycle Storm or versus the Turbo Fog decks, where your own fog plan doesn't really matter. And it's a little bit hard to assemble enough counter magic to deal with what that plan of those decks are doing, especially in game one. So just having the Bojuka Bog can be nice, and you have enough ways for the deck to use it as a black source that you're not, it's not just like a colorless land. Your deck can use the black mana, which is nice as well. But if you really wanted, you could switch this for something else, but I think it's decent enough to play main deck. Then we have 2 islands. So I don't know why I'm proxying an island, but 2 islands. Just so having a way to, you need at least one for sure, because you need a way to map for like an untapped blue source. And when people start cleansing wildfire in your lands, like having a few extra islands in your deck matters. So I like playing 2. But if you really wanted, you could play only 1. You can maybe cut 1 for like a remote isle, so your maps have more utility in the late game. But in general, I don't think that's correct, but it's an option you can think about. And then one more land, the last land, bringing us up to 22. I'm playing 1 Quandrix Campus. I think this card is really good. Just being able to scry every turn is a pretty strong effect. In any situation where you get flooded, you can like end of turn scry, then upkeep scry. Gives you a lot of looks to find something to dig you out of like a problem situation. Again, that's like the kind of card that you could cut for a remote isle, just to give you a map something to do, giving you the immediate cycle rather than having to scry to find cards that you need. But I like the fact that Quandrix Campus adds 2 colors of mana. And I'm not exactly sure actually whether the scry is better than the cycling. So yeah, that's the mana base. Then moving on to the spells, and a lot of these are going to be left over from the old Flicker version of the deck. So I'm going to sort of describe the cards in the deck, like this is the Counterspell package and this is like the Fog package or whatever. But how I classify those might not agree with your own mental like organization scheme or whatever. So if I go through it and you think like, why are you not playing this card, then maybe I just haven't mentioned it yet. So wait until the final list before you make any judgments. So we have the like defense package, which is the same as what I basically always played. The 2 moments piece, 1 Weather the Storm and 1 Tangle. So in the past, like I always referred to the Tangle as like kind of a bit of a meme card, as like people just played all moments piece rather than playing the 1 Tangle. But I've played this deck so much now that I actually think that 1 Tangle is correct. The downside of playing versus maybe like Vigilance creatures, which are pretty rare in Pauper, or like Query and Ranger, things like that, they're not that popular cards right now. And then the effect of not letting your opponent's creatures untap is actually quite strong. It functions as like fog for 2 turns in lots of spots. Not having to spend the mana the next turn to flash it back, and then it's still in your graveyard, so you can loop it back later with a recursion. I think the one Tangle is actually really good. I think the split of like one Tangle plus however many moments piece, I'm really happy with that. In the past, some people didn't play the main deck Weather the Storm, but I always think it's correct. It just gets you out of a bunch of spots that no other card would do, and it functions the same as a Fog in a lot of situations anyway. I definitely think it's correct to play the Weather main deck. And then the other nice thing about the Tangle is that in some matchups you want to board down to one Fog effect, because your opponent's deck is not like super aggro, but they're playing like a mid-range kind of deck where they can have creatures but they're not super aggro, but you just want one Fog as like a failsafe. And when you only have one Fog in your library after sideboarding, the fact that it has flashback is often not very good, because if you flashback your one Fog, then you can never get it back, and you won't be able to do any more Fog for the rest of the game. So if you're in a situation where you never want to flashback your Fog, you just want to cast it and have the option of looping it with Mnemonic Wall or whatever, you don't care about the card having flashback. It's not like a meaningful upside. You'd rather have the extra utility of the not untapping. So there are a lot of matchups, or maybe not a lot of matchups, but it happens enough that I board out the 2 moments piece and I leave the Tangle. So that's just another aspect of the card which I think is worth mentioning. So yeah, these are like the 4 kind of defensive cards, and I think that's the right number to play. I've been on a list that looks like that for a long time. Then in terms of the generic kind of like card draw, card selection elements, we have the 2 Mystical Teachings, 4 Mulldrifters, 4 Impulse, yeah, that's about it. So all of these cards are pretty staple for the Tron deck. Mulldrifter is just one of the best cards for a deck that makes a bunch of mana. It attacks, it blocks, it's card advantage, it does everything you want. You're a deck where you don't really, the 5 mana doesn't bother you that much. Plenty of spots where this is like not that expensive to cast at all. And you can loop it back with your whole recursion package, which we'll get into later. Yeah, just a really solid card for the deck. If you're allowed to play as many as you want, you'd probably play like maybe six copies, something like that. Just a really strong card. Impulse just digs you for what you need at any given moment, whether that's like an extra Tron piece or counter magic or whatever you want. The cantrips like Preordain and that aren't super good for this deck, because usually your blue sources come into play tap on turn 1 anyway, and your deck usually has an abundance of colorless mana, so the extra 1 blue on the impulse isn't that bad. All of your cards are really expensive. You can't, like, there's not likely to be a turn where you play like a Ponder and then you follow it up with like another 1 mana spell. So yeah, even though Impulse looks like a very outdated card in terms of like general MTG power creep standards, it just ticks all the right boxes for what this deck is doing. And then the Mystical Teachings, obviously again, similar to Mulldrifter, it's a really great card for a deck that has a lot of mana. It's resilient to counters because you have to counter it twice. You can Teachings for a second Teachings to like set up whatever combo engine you need. Searches for whatever card to help you in different matchups. Yeah, it's just really nice to have access to that. Then the Flicker package. 3 Mnemonic Wall, 1 Ghostly Flicker, 1 Pulse of Murasa, 1 Ephemerate. So I always like playing 3 Mnemonic Walls. Some people play 2, but like in a late game situation, it's the card that you are often desperately trying to find, and if you don't have a reliable way to tutor for it, because obviously teachings can't find it, so you just need to like draw it naturally or hit it off impulse. And if you only have 2 copies in the deck, it's a little bit too unreliable. So I really like having 3. And then a big strength of the deck is when you get 2 of them plus flicker, which is again much harder to do when you have exactly 2 copies. So I always like playing 3 Mnemonic Wall. Only 1 flicker now. Some lists in the past you played 2, but now you don't have Prophetic Prism to flicker with it. So if you draw a randomly top decker Ghostly Flicker, there's less chance it's going to be just a good card in general. Like you do need much more specific things to combo with it now, which means that you don't want to draw it in more situations than you did previously. So only 1 copy is fine. Pulse of Murasa, I've thought about playing Reaping the Graves over this instead, which can be good because on one hand it's card advantage if you have multiple things to return with it, and it's also a little bit more resilient to counter magic. It's not a bad card, but I think just having the life gain off the Pulse of Murasa is extremely valuable. So that's why I'm playing Pulse. Green mana is a little bit easier to make than black, but that's not a huge issue. And I would keep the Reaping the Graves in mind, because there might be like a slight meta shift that could cause me to want to play that in the future. And then the one Ephemerate is just obviously auto-include the combo with the Mnemonic Wall, which is 2 strongs. Plenty of game states where that basically just wins by itself. Then we have the Counterspells. So I'm playing 1 Memory Lapse, 1 Prohibit, and 1 Exclude. So having the two mana Counterspells is pretty good. You don't really want to play actual Counterspell because the double blue is a little bit of a challenge, especially early in the game when you want to be casting your Counterspells. So having the split is just kind of nice, because in some situations you want to counter their card and send it to the graveyard, and sometimes you just want to be able to counter a card that costs any number of mana. So like if your opponent casts a big Cascade guy, you can Memory Lapse the boarding party, for example, before the Cascade trigger resolves. So then the boarding party will go to the top of their deck and then they will Cascade past it. So that's kind of a nice synergy. Or like versus Gurmag Angler, they delve away their graveyard, then you Memory Lapse their Gurmag Angler, next turn they top deck it and they probably can't cast it because they just exiled their whole graveyard in the previous turn. And again, these are all expensive cards that Prohibit can't even target. So I like having the 1 Memory Lapse. And then Exclude, I'm putting it in the Counterspell section because that's like superficially what it looks like. It says Counterspell on it. But in a way, it's also equally part of the like Counterspell. I mean, sorry, I just said that. It's equally a part of the like card advantage package with all, you can think about it with all the Mulldrifter and the teachings and stuff. Because in a lot of games, okay, maybe I wouldn't say a lot, but in enough games, you want to be able to teachings for a thing that draws cards. So, because it's a game state where it's like a bit grindy and slow, but also you're not in a board state where like Pulse of Murasa has any targets or things like that. So in that situation, if you don't play any card advantage instant, the best thing you can do is just teachings for impulse, which is okay-ish, but not that great. But the problem is that the other options you could play for that effect, so we're talking about things here like Reign of Revelation or the Foretell one, like Behold the Multiverse, something like that. These are kind of awkward cards to be putting in your deck because you don't really need that kind of expensive card advantage effect a lot of the time. it's just a bit too situational. So the nice thing about Exclude is that it's not so heavy on the mana curve. Like, it's not so dirtily as a card like Reign of Revelation. But it still is card advantage. And in the matchups where you do want to be casting teachings sort of for value, Exclude is normally a pretty good card there anyway. So, yeah, for a long time I didn't really think that I liked this card, because I thought as a counterspell it was just too greedy. But once I realized that I sort of wanted one extra kind of card advantage instant in the deck and started thinking about it from that perspective, like, it made a lot more sense, and I'm actually really happy with it now. So I like playing these three counterspells. So I think it makes sense to me. Then the last cards, we still have quite a few left. Oh yeah, so the biggest thing to talk about is the mana spells. So we have the 4 Expedition map, of course, just the best way to find your Tron mana. 1 crop rotation, so it has utility as the like instant speed Bojuka Bog, but it also just helps you find your Tron mana. You can think of it like a 5th Expedition map, but you can also teachings for it, which comes up a reasonable amount of the time. So yeah, sometimes you can sideboard it out because it's like the card disadvantage matters more in a particular matchup, but it's good enough to play one main deck. Then I'm playing 3 Simic Signet, 1 Explore, and the sort of like centerpiece of the deck, or what has like refocused the build for me, is these 4 copies of Navigation Orb. So if you've been following Pauper, you might know what this does, because some of the other like gate-based decks are playing it now. So what it does, it's a 3 mana artifact. You can pay 2 mana and sacrifice it to search your library for up to 2 basic lands or gate cards. Then you put one onto the battlefield tapped and the other one into your hand. So remember, Sea Gate is a gate, Heap Gate is a gate, and you have the 2 basic islands in the list as well. So these are all the different lands you can find with it. So, of course, the place that this occupies in the deck is previously what was the Bonder's Ornament, basically. Like, 3 mana artifact that adds 1 mana of any color, effectively, because you're searching for the Sea Gate with it, which can add whatever color you need, or Heap Gate also adds any color. And it's also card advantage, so it turns into 2 lands. So having this card printed is actually very important for the list, because it took me, I just couldn't find any replacement for the combination of Bonder's Ornament and Prophetic Prism. I couldn't find any replacement for that I was happy with. The card that looked the most similar to it was Network Terminal, which is a 3 mana artifact, taps for 1 mana of any color. You can pay 1 mana, tap it, tap an untapped artifact, and then loot, draw 1, discard 1. So that card looked like a kind of crappy Bonder's Ornament replacement, but the problem with the Network Terminal, firstly, was that like looting was much worse than drawing a card, which is kind of obvious, but the way the Tron deck plays a lot of the time is you have a ton of cards in hand, right? Because you're playing a bunch of Mulldrifters and you're drawing plenty of cards. But when things aren't going quite to plan, you can really get some like clunky draws, and looting doesn't really fix that in the same way that straight up drawing cards does. And the other problem with the Network Terminal was that tapping down an artifact as a cost for it was relatively difficult to do, especially when you don't have the Prophetic Prism in the list anymore. Like, you have no free artifact. So I had a bunch of artifact lands in a build that I was playing with the Cleansing Wildfire, and you could tap those to activate your Network Terminal, but every turn you were doing that, you were losing a colored source. So you were losing the colored source from your bridge to activate your terminal, and you were also losing the colored source from the terminal itself. So it was very hard to like play a spell and use the terminal in the same turn. So that wasn't great. And also, if you tap down like a Signet for your terminal, that you're also losing your colored source there. So it was very difficult to like find places to activate the terminal that actually made sense. Some people tried it in a build with Ichor Wellspring, because in that case you do have that kind of cantripping artifact that's free to tap. But then when you start cutting your like signets for Ichor Wellspring, you have too many hands where you draw like Tron land, Ichor Wellspring, and you just don't have any colored mana to cast anything. So I couldn't get Network Terminal to work. But I think the deck does really need like that critical density of colorless artifacts that filter your Tron mana into colored mana. So you could just cut, if you said, well, if you need card advantage, you could just cut these for like a big card draw spell, like a whatever divination variant you like Deep Analysis or whatever. And yeah, some games that will be like totally fine, but the power of the Tron list is that you can really convert your excess colorless mana into like action, because you've seen all the spells, right? It's not like the modern Tron deck where you get your colorless mana and then you play like Karn or Wurmcoil or whatever. You need all of the colored mana to cast your spells, and if your access to colored mana is gated by your land drops, like you draw a bunch of cards off of your Deep Analysis, but then in order to play a colored spell, you just have to play your like one island or even your one tap land, you're just going to fall behind so easily, or you're just not going to be able to hit your Tron land drops, and you're just going to be like a weird generic control deck that's just like playing Deep Analysis off of 4 mana and then playing another tap land and not even doing anything special with all your mana. Like I'll say it again, having the filtering from colorless mana into colored mana is really, really key. And the combination of what this does in terms of the like card advantage and the ramp, setting up your like Heap Gate to start making treasures, all of that is really, really nice of what this Navigation Orb does. So I think it's pretty correct for the deck to play it. Like I've been really happy with it so far. So in terms of this like 3 Simic Signet, 1 Explore split, I've tried Explore in the past and thought it was like a little bit of a meme. Like Explore in Tron obviously has some kind of like funny appeal to it, because it can sort of function as like a Desperate Ritual kind of card in some spots, because it costs you 2 mana to cast it, but if you play a Urza Tower off it, you get 3 mana, so it's like a ritual effect. Or even if you just play like Urza's Mine, then you get the mana back. So I mean, it's kind of natural that you would think to try it, but the problem with Explorer in the past was that your decks have relatively low land count, right? If you look at the decks in Modern playing Explorer, they'll often play like, if they're like a Valakut deck, they'll probably have at least 25, 26 lands. If they're, I'm talking if they're like the Scapeshift or whatever, maybe even more than that. And then if they're like the Amulet deck, they might have like 30 lands or something. Whereas this list only has 22. You don't want to play a ton of lands in your Tron deck, because you're getting all of your mana from the fact that the Tron lands add more than 1 mana per land. Like if you start playing that 25 plus lands in your Tron deck, you're just gonna have too many games, you mana flood and not do anything. So in the past, that was why Explore was kind of not that great. But the two issues were that like I wanted another kind of mana card, but I didn't want to play 4 signets because you really kind of only want to draw 1 signet per game. Once you get the filtering from blue and green, you're pretty much good to go. You don't really need to draw another one. Like in a kind of late game situation where you're drawing tons of cards, it is kind of nice that you can say, well, like, okay, I'll play my Tron land and a signet, so I'm getting all the ramp and the colors, like everything's firing on all cylinders, great. But in general, you don't really need to draw so many copies of the signet. So basically, I kind of want to play 4 signets, but I kind of don't because when you flood on them, it's bad. So like, what is another kind of mana card I could play that cycles? So Explore kind of fits that role. And the other thing is that when you have the Navigation Orb, like it puts a land into play and a land into your hand. So you do end up in kind of mid to late game situations where you have extra lands in your hand, even though you're a low land count deck. So there are far fewer situations now where Explore is just like 1 and a green, draw a card, pass the turn. So with all of those things added up, I'm like relatively happy with the 1 copy of Explore. Yeah, I think it's fine. And some people are going to be asking, like, can you play Growth Spiral instead? Like you're a blue and green deck, you have instants in your deck, isn't that like the thing you could do? And the answer is no. Like it's just too greedy on the mana. There's plenty of hands where you have like Sea Gate, Tron land or something, and then Growth Spiral just won't even do anything. Like the fact that it's an instant isn't that valuable. You're never going to be teachings for it, and then holding up the mana on your opponent's turn, it doesn't have that much value either. So yeah, definitely don't play Growth Spiral. Play the Explore. And then the last 2 cards. So if for some reason you've been counting, that should be 58 cards. The last 2 cards, the win conditions, I have 1 Dinrova Horror and 1 Compulsive Research. So the 1 Dinrova Horror is just fine. Like when you have the flicker loop in your deck, it's just one of the best finishes that the list can play. Sometimes you want to have a way to just deal with some kind of weird permanent, which the list doesn't otherwise have. And it like induces your opponents to concede the game. So again, yeah, it's just the kind of like brute force, drop the hammer type of card that the deck can play. What I have considered recently is instead of this playing Capsize, and sort of like Explore that in the past, that was a bit of like a meme card. It seems like it would be really good, just like Explore in the Tron deck, because if you have a ton of mana and you're a blue deck, well, you can start buybacking it multiple times, you hit all your opponent's lands, and then they can't do anything. Well, the problem with Capsize was that, first of all, that's very slow. And even if you're buybacking it twice, you like bounce 2 of their lands, then the next turn they're going to replay a land, so you effectively only bounced 1 land and it costs you like 12 mana. Realistically, how much mana do you have even in like a very extreme late game situation? Having 12 mana to like buy back your Capsize and then also not die to their creatures and stuff is pretty hard to do. So again, Capsize wasn't that great in the past, but now when you have the Navigation Orb, you get into situations in the mid to late game where you have a lot more blue sources than you did previously. So getting the Capsize buyback off is like a little bit easier than it was in the past. And you also have situations in the late game where you like stack up a bunch of treasures. Then you get to a point where you're like, okay, now I have all these treasures banked up. Buyback, 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 and then once you do that, it becomes a little bit more difficult for your opponent to play the game. And the other thing about Capsize that's quite nice now is that these gate decks, like dedicated gate decks with Basilisk Gate, are becoming a little bit more popular. So they're really quite slow at setting up. They don't interact with you that much. And buybacking, bouncing their lands is really good because if all their lands come into play tapped, so buybacking, bouncing it slows them down a lot, and they rely on having their lands in play as their win condition because they're Basilisk Gate based. And also Capsize is an instant, so you can teachings for it. That matters a lot. Yeah, I don't want to understate that. Like if Dinrova Horror had Flash, it would obviously be an insane card, but also you'd be able to teachings for it, and then it would, in my mind, it would very clearly be better than Capsize, like no contest. So overall, I think Dinrova Horror is still probably a bit better, but Capsize is sort of like edged closer to being viable in my mind with this build of the deck and this like slight meta shift recently. But again, Capsize is also, there's other aspects of the meta that do make Capsize look bad, like the fact that Munitions and Deadly Dispute are so popular is like a strike against Capsize because they can sack whatever you target and then fizzle their buyback. So yeah, probably just go with the Dinrova Horror at the moment. I did try again the Rolling Thunder, especially with the idea that you have more ramp in the deck now with the Orb and the Banking Treasures, but again, I just don't like that card very much. It feels like more of a kind of training wheels type of card, even more than Dinrova Horror does. Like you could argue that even Dinrova Horror is training wheels, and you just win by like fog blocking and Flicker Loop plus Counterspell plus decking your opponent out. But yeah, I think overall I'm still pretty happy to play the one Dinrova Horror. And then the last card is the Compulsive Research. So why I didn't put this card in with the Counterspell stuff is that it was, I mean, I keep saying Counterspells when I mean the card advantage stuff, is because a lot of the time in the past this was considered as one of your routes to win the game, because you can target your opponent with it to make them draw cards, and then either they have no cards left because the game's dragged on that long, or they have no lands anymore because you bounce them all with the Dinrova Horror. So you just flicker, get your Compulsive Research back a few times, and then you target your opponent to make them draw their library. So that matters in games where you're playing versus like Familiars or Elves, where they have like a bazillion life and you can't kill them in time with like attacking with Mulldrifters or something like that, even if you bounced all their stuff with Dinrova. So while I do think that is like a relevant thing to consider, the Compulsive Research is one of the like most uncertain cards, probably the most uncertain card on the list for me at the moment. So the first issue is that if you want a card that does that, like a draw spell that you can target the opponent, Deep Analysis might actually be better. So, you know, like it draws you more cards, so you can draw 4 off it rather than draw 3, discard 1, which matters quite a bit. So that's a thing. Then the other aspect of having whether we want to play that as a win condition is your deck has Memory Lapse in it. So even if you didn't have Compulsive Research, you could win those games by decking just by Memory Lapsing your own spells. So you don't strictly need the draw spell that targets the opponent to win those games. So while I'm like still relatively happy with Compulsive Research just as a kind of divination variant, because you very rarely win those games with the like deck out, I mean, it does come up sometimes, but usually you find your Dinrova Horror and then you just bounce whatever's giving you trouble and then you start attacking them. But there are games where you have the like fog lock going for the whole game and you can't find your Dinrova Horror or whatever. So the card draw thing can be useful sometimes. But yeah, there's that question of like, A, is Memory Lapse good enough? B, would Deep Analysis perhaps not be better? So yeah, so I'm not exactly sure what I could swap that to. But yeah, that's the list. So yeah, the Dinrova Horror and the Compulsive Research are the two cards which are like most personal preference-y. Because some people will also play cards like one of main deck Lightning Bolt, which you can flicker loop that to kill your opponent, and it also provides you with some options for main deck removal. I tried that, I didn't like it too much at the moment, but again, it's like another option that's reasonable. Onto the sideboard. So 4 Pyroblast, good versus blue decks. 4 Hydroblast, good versus red decks. 1 Cast Down, good against any creature, and particularly versus decks that don't have red or blue creatures that you can't blast. 1 Dispel, again, good versus any instant, but particularly those ones that you can't blast. Breath Weapon, so this is like the new Fiery Cannonade. It's slightly better than Fiery Cannonade just because of Crimson Fleet Commodore, the like 5/2 Monarch guy. There's no playable dragon in Pauper, but there is one playable pirate, so Breath Weapon is like a slight upgrade, and I like the art better anyway. So 1 Ancient Grudge. I don't know if this card is needed anymore. It's not very effective versus Affinity. Like, it can be sometimes, but it's a bit unreliable. And in the past, you could board it in versus like the Tron mirrors to blow up the Bonders Ornaments, things like that. Like there were enough like mid-range mirrors or like Tron mirrors where you would both have Bonders Ornaments. So having like 1 Ancient Grudge in your 75 to win the Bonders Ornament war was like pretty relevant. But now that's not a thing in the metagame anymore. And like playing 1 Ancient Grudge versus Affinity might be too slow. So it's basically being reduced to a kind of like tutorable blow up your Relic of Progenitors thing, which is arguably an effect that you shouldn't even really need. But I mean, it's not that. So again, it might be one of those like training wheels type cards. I'm still like a little bit afraid to cut it, but it's okay versus Affinity, and it might be alright if your opponent's a bit of a Dumbo and they bought in like 5 Tormod's Crypts or whatever. It's just like a nice effect to have access to. You could play 1 Declaimer or something like that in this slot as well, which is nice because you can screw up the Wildfire players with it, and versus Bogles you can hit their Mask or Armadillo Cloak or whatever, so another thing to think about. But yeah, I'm fine with the Ancient Grudge. I would play 1 more anti-artifact card. And most recently I was playing Gorilla Shaman and being relatively happy with it. But I think actually what the pick might be is what am I thinking of? Fangren Marauder. So you have the ramp to cast it within like a reasonable time frame, and versus those matchups like Affinity and also the Madness deck, which are the two matchups where I would board in Gorilla Shaman. Fangren Marauder is arguably stronger anyway. Like it blocks all their stuff on the ground, and it gains your life so you don't die to makeshift munitions or go out of glass and stuff. And you have a lot of artifacts in the deck that self-sack anyway, so you have all the Expedition Map, Bonders Ornament, self-sacks as well. So you have a lot of ways to trigger the gain 5 life yourself. You don't have to wait for your opponent to sacrifice something, which is pretty nice. Even the treasures off the Heap Gate gain 5 life off of the Fangren Marauder, which is pretty funny as well. Like you can get into spots where you just like cast your Fangren Marauder and then sack 2 or 3 treasures and then gain that much life. It probably puts the game away by itself. Yeah, so that's worth thinking about. So Fangren Marauder or Gorilla Shaman. The Heap Gate has a lot of like different utility. I've even sacrificed the treasures for the Ulamog's Crusher Annihilator before, which is pretty strange, but you know, anything could happen. So the last couple of cards, one Negate. This is probably like the weakest card in the sideboard, but I'm just not entirely sure what to cut it for, if anything. Like, there are a lot of times where I wish it could just be a Seek and Dispel, because it's a bit more mana efficient in the matchups versus like Cycle Storm or something where you really want to counter the Songs of the Damned. So yeah, it's just like a kind of card where in matchups where you really want more coverage versus stack interaction, like it's just the most flexible yet efficient option. But I haven't mathed out all the sideboard plans versus the different decks to really examine whether it makes sense or not. And the last sideboard card is what I used to always play one slot just as like a mid-range breaker. So like a big effect that's hard to counter. So Entourage of Trest is, I would say, hard to counter because you can't Hydro or Pyroblast it. It has a big body, and once you start drawing cards off the Monarch, then you should be good to go. I don't know if that effect is really needed, actually. That is another type of Training Wheels type of card, perhaps. One card which I do really want to play in the sideboard after testing a bit in the leagues is 1 or 2 copies of Desert. Just as a card versus mono blue. So it gives your expedition map a lot more utility because a big part of their game plan involves chipping you out with the 1/1 flyers, but also they're playing I think a full playset of the Kamigawa Ninja, the new one, which also only has 1 toughness. So having the 1 desert really like stymies their offense, I think. And you don't generally want or need like the full Tron mana in those matchups anyway, because a lot of the time your game plan is just to like barely stay alive. So you need a lot of colored mana early because you want to be like pyroblasting their stuff or just like teachings for breath weapon, things like that. So if you have to use your map to find a desert, that could be a lot more valuable than using it to find your missing Tron piece or whatever. So I think that could be a really good option. I don't know if you want to play 1 or 2, because if you just play 1, it gives you the maximum utility from your expedition map and things like that. Like the marginal upgrade of having 1 versus having 0 is very big, and then adding a second one doesn't help as much in that regard. But having the second one just gives you more chances to draw it naturally, and also once you have 2 in play, like it makes it way harder for them to like swarm you with 1/1s, which can sometimes beat like a single desert. And it also means that you can kill 2 toughness things, so it kills the ninja of the decals as well. So yeah, one or 2 I think is pretty justifiable, but I don't think you have space to play more than that. You could also play 1 main deck and swap it over the Bog, move the Bog to the sideboard. That could be an option as well. But yeah, mono blue has always been a challenging matchup for Tron. Just the way the game plans line up versus each other, it's very difficult for you to beat that deck. In the past, that's been true as well. So playing 1 or 2 cards just dedicated for that is pretty valuable. I don't know if you would board a Desert versus any other matchup. It might be okay versus like Elves, just to stop them from killing you with like ragtag beats with the like Korean Ranger or whatever, but normally that's not how that matchup goes. Normally you care way more about getting your fog set up. So I don't know if that's correct either. Desert might just be a card for the mono blue matchup. I suppose you could board it in versus the other Fairies variants as well. But even just as an anti-mono blue card, it still probably could be worth it. Oh, and here's my treasure token for the Heap Gate. So yeah, that is the Tron deck as of August 2022. If you want to get your Orb on in Pauper, I think this is a good way of going about it. If you want to play Urza's Tower in Pauper, I think this is a good way of going about it. Thanks for watching. I think I checked, I'm at 98 subscribers now. So if you want to help me get up to the triple digits, hit that button. This has been Life TCG, Pauper Tron, signing out.